All right, get ready for a wild ride today because we're diving headfirst into a media frenzy that's erupted in Europe.
Yeah.
And it all revolves around some unexpected turns in U.S.-Russia relations and the war in Ukraine.
Absolutely.
What's even more intriguing is that we're going to be hearing from someone who was right in the thick of things in the diplomatic world.
Right.
We're talking firsthand insights, shifting alliances, accusations of propaganda flying back and forth.
Lots of that.
And a whole lot of political maneuvering.
Yeah, it's a real whirlwind, especially with President Trump's push for these peace talks with Russia.
I was going to say, that's a major shift, isn't it? After years and years of, pretty harsh anti-Russia rhetoric.
It really is a seismic shift, you could say.
And it seems like the shockwaves are being felt across the pond.
Oh, definitely.
Especially in the UK.
Yeah.
The European media, political circles, everyone's in a bit of a tizzy.
You could say that controlled chaos might be a better way to put it.
Controlled chaos.
Well, maybe not so controlled when you look at the British media in particular.
Oh, you mean?
They've gone from, advocating this hard-line stance against Russia to practically accusing President Trump of selling out.
Wow.
They're throwing around terms like defeat and drawing all these parallels to historical appeasement.
It's like the whole narrative they've been pushing is collapsing.
Exactly, a complete narrative upheaval.
So how did we even get to this point? Why is Europe, especially the UK, so entrenched in this anti-Russia position?
Well, a lot of it can be traced back to the 2014 Ukraine crisis.
Okay, that makes sense.
Basically, back then, there was this decision to just stop talking directly to Russia.
Really? Just cut off all communication?
Pretty much. Instead, they opted for this war of narratives, this battle fought mostly through the media.
So, propaganda as policy, essentially.
No, you could say that.
That sounds like a recipe for disaster, wouldn't you say?
Well, it seems to have backfired pretty spectacularly.
Oh, in what way?
It's like they built this dam of propaganda, this wall preventing any real dialogue. Right. And now that dam's starting to crumble, those cracks are appearing.
And the leaks are springing too, I bet.
Exactly. And the problem is, relying on propaganda like that, it creates this distorted reality.
It's hard to know what to believe anymore.
That's right. You can't separate fact from fiction, genuine concerns from manufactured outrage.
And now you have this palpable sense of betrayal in Europe.
Absolutely.
They followed the U.S. lead, amplified the anti-Russia messaging, and now they feel abandoned.
Like they're being left out to dry.
Exactly.
The cracks in this so-called collective West are becoming more and more obvious.
It makes you wonder, is the U.S. actually any less Russophobic? Or is this just a strategic move, driven by practicality?
That's a really good question.
And where does this leave Europe?
In a tough spot.
Can they afford to keep supporting the war in Ukraine if the U.S. pulls back?
That's a crucial question, especially with the economic challenges Europe's already facing.
Things are tough all over.
Keeping the war effort going is draining their resources, and if it drags on without U.S. support, it could be devastating, economically speaking.
Not to mention the political risks for European leaders who are still pushing for the war.
Especially with rising nationalist sentiment in countries like Germany, Hungary, and Austria.
So they're really walking a tightrope.
A very delicate balancing act.
It's strange to think, but could this actually make Europe even more anti-Russia if the U.S. starts normalizing relations?
It's paradoxical, but yeah, it's a possibility.
How so?
If they just dig in their heels and refuse to adapt to the changing situation, it could deepen their resentment.
Interesting.
And make them even more adversarial toward Russia.
Makes you think.
And you can't forget about Europe's limited military capacity.
Right. They rely heavily on the U.S. for weapons and support.
Exactly. They're very dependent, which limits their options and makes them vulnerable to U.S. pressure.
Makes sense.
One of our sources, a former Spanish ambassador, revealed something pretty startling.
Oh, what's that?
Apparently, European diplomats were well aware of the situation on the ground, the potential problems with this approach.
But they didn't say anything.
They felt they couldn't, like they were muzzled.
Why? Were they afraid of causing a stir?
It seems there was a lack of strong political leadership willing to challenge the prevailing narrative.
So nobody wanted to rock the boat.
And then there's this entity called the European External Action Service.
I've heard of that.
They operate with a lot of autonomy, which shields them from public scrutiny and limits accountability.
Sounds like a recipe for bad decisions.
Precisely. A lack of transparency and accountability at the heart of European foreign policy.
That's a pretty damning indictment.
It is, and it contrasts sharply with the UK's approach, where it seems diplomats and politicians were more in sync.
But that hasn't exactly gone smoothly either, has it?
Not really. The new U.S. administration has been pretty critical of Europe.
On what grounds?
particularly regarding their state of democracy and free speech.
Interesting.
And let's just say the response from Europe hasn't been very welcoming.
So they're not taking the criticism well.
It's been met with a lot of anger, what you might call red-faced anger, especially in the UK.
I can imagine.
It's classic cognitive dissonance.
How so?
They've built their identity on being these champions of democracy and human rights, and now they're being called out for not living up to those ideals.
It's got to sting a bit.
It does. And speaking of stinging rebukes, our sources mentioned an incident with the head of the Munich Security Conference.
What happened?
Apparently, he broke down in tears at a press conference.
Really? Wow, that's a pretty public display of emotion.
It is, and I think it reveals the inner turmoil a lot of those in power are experiencing right now.
In what way?
They're being forced to confront the failure of their policies, the realization that the narratives they've been clinging to are crumbling.
It's all coming to a head.
Exactly, triggering this wave of emotional responses.
It's a lot to process, that's for sure. And it makes you wonder, how's the rest of the world watching all of this unfold?
With a mix of amusement and concern, I'd say.
Especially China and the global south.
Right. They see Europe's predicament as a self-inflicted wound, a consequence of their own misguided policies.
And their failure to adapt to a changing world order.
Exactly, which further isolates Europe on the global stage, makes them appear out of touch and increasingly irrelevant.
Instead of taking a hard look in the mirror, they seem to be resorting to just shifting the narrative, trying to explain away their miscalculations without taking any real responsibility.
It's a dangerous cycle of denial and deflection.
And it speaks to a larger issue, doesn't it? The decline of critical foreign policy development in Europe.
Absolutely. They've become too reliant on reactive, knee-jerk responses instead of engaging in long-term strategic thinking.
Like they've gone from masters of geopolitics,
albeit often for the wrong reasons.
right, to being trapped in this constant cycle of crisis management.
Exactly.
And you can't ignore the role of bureaucracy in all of this.
No, you can't.
The EU and NATO have become these massive entities.
Behemoths.
Their pursuit of power and expansion has overshadowed their original purpose.
They've become these self-perpetuating machines, churning away without a clear vision or direction.
So what's the solution?
They need to become more visionary, less centralized.
Give more power back to the individual member states.
Exactly. Allow for greater political freedom.
That's a tall order, isn't it? These institutions are deeply entrenched. Their interests are intertwined.
It's a monumental challenge for sure.
It's hard to imagine them willingly giving up power and embracing a more decentralized approach.
It is, but if Europe wants to regain its footing on the world stage, they need to break free from these bureaucratic shackles and rediscover their ability for bold strategic thinking.
Otherwise, they risk becoming increasingly irrelevant as the world moves on without them.
That's the risk.
And that brings us to NATO.
A cornerstone of Western strength and unity, or so we thought.
It's facing a reckoning, isn't it?
It is. You could argue that NATO has suffered a strategic defeat, especially when it comes to their goal of containing Russia's influence.
So is this the beginning of the end for NATO?
It's too early to tell. Some people believe it's become a relic of the Cold War, that it's outlived its usefulness.
I can see that perspective.
But there are also strong arguments for its continued relevance, especially in terms of deterring Russian aggression and fostering transatlantic cooperation.
I can see that side of it too.
It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
It always is.
But there's another dimension to NATO that often gets overlooked, the economic side of things.
What do you mean?
It's essentially a massive market for weapons, with the U.S. being the primary supplier.
Ah, so there are powerful economic interests tied to NATO's existence.
Absolutely. Over half of global weapons supplies come from the U.S., and a significant portion of that comes from NATO contracts.
So it's not just about strategic considerations.
No, the economic interests are deeply intertwined, which adds another layer of complexity to the debate about NATO's future.
It's a reminder that power, in all its forms, plays a huge role in shaping international relations. And as we continue to navigate this complex geopolitical chessboard,
we need to be aware of the various motivations and interests at play. And speaking of navigating complexities, let's bring this down to Ulf for a moment. What does all this geopolitical drama mean for the average person? How's all this going to impact their daily lives?
that's a great question. In a very practical sense, I think we can expect continued economic instability, potential energy shortages, Maybe even some social unrest as this conflict drags on.
Yeah, the consequences are going to be far-reaching.
And there's the psychological impact, too. Years of propaganda and fear-mongering.
It takes a toll.
It creates this atmosphere of suspicion and division that's not going to be easy to overcome.
It's like a poison that seeps into society, erodes trust, makes it hard to have meaningful conversations about the future.
It's a breeding ground for extremism and intolerance, which really undermines those democratic values that Europe claims to hold so dear.
It's a stark reminder that the true costs of conflict go way beyond what we see on the battlefield.
It's a pretty bleak picture.
It is.
But is there any room for optimism? Can Europe actually get out of this mess and find a new path forward?
There's always hope. Europe has a remarkable history of resilience, innovation. They've overcome so many challenges in the past.
It has.
And they have the potential to do it again, but it's going to require a real shift in mindset.
What do you think that would look like? What needs to change?
They need to be willing to challenge the status quo, to question their own assumptions.
Be open to new ideas.
Exactly. Prioritize cooperation and dialogue over confrontation and isolation.
So less us versus them, more we're all in this together.
And they need to recognize that their future isn't entirely in their own hands.
What do you mean?
Engaging with the rest of the world, building those bridges, fostering partnerships, that's essential for their survival and success in the long run.
It sounds like they need a pretty radical overhaul, both internally and in terms of how they interact with the world.
You could say that clinging to outdated ideologies and this sense of exceptionalism is only going to lead to further isolation.
And irrelevance.
In a world that's becoming increasingly interconnected, they need to adapt or they'll get left behind.
So the challenge is clear. Will Europe seize this opportunity to reinvent itself? Or will they succumb to these forces of division, inertia, and decline?
That's the question. And the answer will have huge implications, not just for Europe, but for the whole world.
Because a weak and divided Europe doesn't benefit anyone.
No, it doesn't.
The world needs a strong, united, forward-thinking Europe.
A Europe that can contribute to a more peaceful and prosperous future for everyone.
That's the hope, isn't it? That Europe can rise to the occasion and fulfill its potential as a force for good in the world.
I believe it's possible.
Well, on that note of cautious optimism, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive.
I agree.
We've covered a lot of ground today, from those shifting dynamics in U.S.-Russia, relations to the internal struggles, and really existential questions facing Europe.
We've explored the power of propaganda, the fragility of narratives, and the immense challenges of navigating this rapidly changing world order.
And hopefully we've left you with some things to think about, some questions to ponder as you continue to try to make sense of it all.
Because ultimately, the future isn't something that just happens to us. It's something we create through our choices, our actions, and our willingness to have these open and informed discussions about the challenges we face.
So keep asking those questions, keep challenging assumptions, and keep searching for those deeper insights that can help us build a better world for everyone.
That's the key.
Subscribe to our podcast, available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.